Now, section 11.1, we learn how to do the square root on each side. We learn by solving by doing the square root. Now, section 11.2, we learn how to do by completing the square. Now, in 11.3, I'm going to show you guys how to solve quadratic equations, but now we're going to use what we call the quadratic formula. You guys might have heard of the quadratic formula before, and probably you guys hated it. So instead of giving you guys the formula as negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a, because that's how you guys learned it, I'm going to give you guys the story instead. The story, it is intended for you guys just to remember the formula. I came out with this formula, this story, just so you guys could try to remember the formula. So I'm going to call it the bad boy story. So the way this story goes is, a bad boy went to a so-called, so that's why yes or no, plus or minus, so-called radical party, since we call this radical. Remember, a bad boy went to a so-called radical party because the boy was being squared. That's when you don't talk to anybody. Because the boy was being squared, he lost a chance with 4 awesome chicks. Remember, this is intended for us to help remember the story. Now, everything was over at 2 a.m. Remember, a bad boy went to a so-called radical party because the boy was being squared. He lost a chance with 4 awesome chicks. Everything was over at 2 a.m. Now, the A, B, and C, the letters that I'm using, the A is the number in front of the x square. The B is the number in front of the x, with the sign included, obviously. And C is the constant. Make sure the right side is equal to 0. Now, the book is going to remind us that make sure, it says in the quadratic formula, the square root is added to or subtracted from the value of negative b before dividing by 2a. So what it says is make sure you work the top before you divide by 2a. So let's take a look. Let me remember the formula. Negative b plus or minus b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So let me identify my A, my B, and my C. So my A is 6. Oops. My A is 6. My B is negative 5. And my C is negative 4. Let me bring up the formula again. To be honest, the one thing that is going to be difficult is the square root. So let me focus on that first. The square root of b squared minus 4ac. Let me just focus on that. So I'm looking at b squared minus 4ac. Because I'm looking at the square root. I know b is negative 5. So let me write this as negative 5 squared minus 4 times 6 times a negative 4. So I have that 25 plus. And the reason why I'm saying plus is because I see 2 negative signs. Right? A negative with a negative becomes a positive. So that's just why I wrote that as a plus. Then I'm just going to think 4 times 6 times 4. Right? I'm just going to multiply those numbers. That gives me 96. 25 plus 96. I'm just adding those two. That gives me 121. But remember, I'm dealing with the square root of it. So I'm going to do the square root of 121, which is just 11. Once again, I was just working the square root part. Now, when I'm doing the formula, let me plug in the whole formula again. I'm going to use the whole formula. Negative b. I know my b is negative. So the negative of a negative, I'm just going to write this as positive 5. Plus or minus 11. I'm not going to do the whole square root again. I just did. So I have 5 plus or minus 11, because that's what I got for the whole square root, all over. At the bottom, I have to do 2 times a. I know the a is 6. So 2 times 6 is 12. And that's my answer. Now, if you can simplify it, by all means, do simplify. So I'm looking on the top. Remember, I'm looking at as a positive or negative sign. Let me look at this as the positive sign first. So I'm thinking 5 plus 11, 16 over 12. So I was looking at the plus sign first. Now 16 over 12 can be simplified, right? Divide each number by 4. So 4 over 3. Now consider on the top the minus sign now. 5 minus 11. Negative 6 over 12. I'm going to simplify that as negative 1/2. So all I did was I did the square root first. Notice I just did the square root by itself. Right, I got the square root of b squared minus 4ac was 11. So first I just did b squared minus 4ac. Once I got 121, I did the square root of it, and then I used the whole formula. Now, one other case, remember, I'm just giving you guys a quadratic formula to help you guys out. But if you guys are into factoring, you guys could have factored this. If you guys want to factor, by all means, do factor. You can still factor it. The quadratic formula is just another way you guys can solve for this. Okay, now you try these at home. Remember the quadratic formula. And those are your answers. Let me do one more case. Example 2. My A is 9. My B is positive 12. And my C is positive 4, right? I want to identify my A, B, and C. Let me remember the quadratic formula. I'm going to focus only on the square root first. So I'm thinking of b squared minus 4ac, and then I'll do the square root on it. All right, so b squared is 12 squared minus 4 times 9 times 4. 12 squared is 144 minus 4 times 9 times 4 gives me 144. That's 0. Right, 144 minus 144 is 0. Get the square root of it. The square root of 0 is 0. Okay, so that's not that bad. Now let me use the whole formula. Negative b. So I'm going to write negative 12 plus or minus 0, because I just worked that, all over 2 times a, that gives me 18. All right, so now I'm going to get my answers from here. The first case, let me do the plus sign. Negative 12 plus 0 is negative 12 over 18. Now, negative 12 over 18, I can simplify this. I'm going to, right, the number's 12 over 18. At least I'm going to simplify that as 2 over 3. The negative sign, I'm going to bring it to the front. So negative 2 over 3. When I do the minus sign, I do the minus sign. Negative 12 minus 0 is negative 12 over 18. I notice I'm going to get the same solution. So I'm just going to write it once. My answer in this case is negative 2/3. Now you try this at home. Remember the quadratic formula. And you should get just, in this case, you also get just one answer. It's 5 over 2. Make sure the right side is equal to 0. So in this case, before I start identifying what's my A, my B, and my C, I'm going to move everything to where the x squared is positive. So in this case, I'm going to move everything to the left. So I have, right, the 8x, I'm going to move it as a negative 8x. The minus 1, I'm going to move it over as a positive 1. So I have 4x squared minus 8x plus 1 is equal to 0. Like I said, I must have one side equal to 0. My A is 4, my B is -8, and my C is +1. Let me remember the quadratic formula. I'm going to think of the square root part first. I'm thinking of B squared minus 4AC. The boy was being squared, so he lost a chance with 4 awesome chicks. Remember I said that in the story. Now I'm thinking of this as -8 squared minus 4 times 4 times 1. Right, 4 times A times C. Now here I have -8 squared is 64. Minus 16, right? 4 times 4 times 1. Now 64 minus 16 is 48. Now when I do the square root of 48, unfortunately that's not a perfect square. However, I can simplify this. I'm thinking of, I'm thinking of my perfect square root. I'm thinking that the square root of 4, the square root of 9, the square root of 16, square root of 25, on and on. I'm going to split square root of 48 as the square root of 16 times the square root of 3. I know 16 times 3 is 48. 16 is a perfect squared. So this is 4 radical 3. Remember I said that the hardest part was the square root. So we just did the hardest part. Okay, so now let me use the whole formula. Now when I go -b, I'm just I know my A, my B, and my C values. So negative of a negative is going to give me +8 plus or minus 4 radical 3 over, now 2 times A gives me 8. Now the top cannot be combined though. 8 plus 4 radical 3, I cannot combine them because the 8 is a whole number, 4 radical 3 has a radical. However, I can still simplify this a little bit. I see my whole numbers. There's an 8, there's a 4, there's an 8. I must divide all of them by the same number. So in this case, I'm going to divide everything by 4. So I get 2 plus or minus 1 radical 3 over 2. Right? I divided each of my whole numbers by 4. That's what gave me 2 plus or minus 1 radical 3 over 2. So when I write this, I'm just going to write this as 2 plus or minus the square root of 3 over 2. Right? The one outside of the radical is optional. I chose not to write it. The hard part is the square root. So that's what I do first. Before solving, every quadratic equation must be expressed in standard form, which is, everything on the left, the right side equal to 0. Or everything on one side and the other side equal to 0. Move it to where the x squared is positive. Now you try these at home. Remember the quadratic formula? And you should end up getting these as your answers. Now let's take a look at this part. When the right side is equal to 0, when the right side is equal to 0, I can just let each of my factors equal to 0. When the right side, in this case, is not equal to 0, What I'm going to do is get rid of parentheses. Let me distribute the 9x. So that's going to give me 9x squared minus 9x. Now let me distribute the 3. Plus 3x minus 3 is equal to negative 8. Right, I'm just getting rid of parentheses. Let me combine some like terms if I can. I have 9x squared minus 6x minus 3 is equal to negative 8. Notice I combine the x's. One of my sides must be equal to 0. So minus 8, I'm going to move it over as a plus 8. So I have 9x squared minus 6x plus 5 is equal to 0. So I can see my A is 9, my B is negative 6, and my C is equal to 5. Let me remember the quadratic formula. I'm just going to work the square root part first. I'm thinking B squared minus 4AC. Right, the boy was being squared, so he lost a chance with 4 awesome chicks. Once I solve for that, I'll do the square root on it. All right, so B squared, negative 6 squared, minus 4 times 9 times 5. Right, negative 6 squared is 36 minus 4 times 9 times 5 is 180. Now 36 minus 180 is negative 144. Let me get the square root of it. I know the square root of 144 is 12. So the square root of negative 144 should give me 12i. Remember I said the square root is the hardest part. So now I'm going to use my whole formula. Let me remember my A, my B, and my C. So when I look at the formula, negative B, the negative of a negative is going to give me positive 6 plus or minus 12i all over 2 times A gives me 18. I look at my whole numbers. There's a 6, there's a 12, and there's an 18th. I ask myself, I can simplify this if all of them can be divided by the same thing. In this case, I can divide all of them by 6. So my answer will be 1 plus or minus 2i all over 3. Now my math lab, this is fine. 1 plus or minus 2i all over 3. That's correct. My math lab sometimes might ask you guys to break it as 1 plus 2i over 3 and 1 minus 2i over 3. Right, just for you split the plus or minus. Sometimes it might ask you to split it. Sometimes it even goes a little bit further. It says not only you can split the plus or minus, but you can split the fraction. Notice how everything is over 3. So it might ask you to write this as 1 over 3 plus 2 over 3i, because it's going to take the I out. And then 1 over 3 minus 2 over 3i. It might even ask you to split the fraction. But I'm fine with 1 plus 2i, 1 plus or minus 2i all over 3. Now this you should try it at home. Remember the quadratic formula. In this case, your answer should be 2 plus or minus I. Now on your discriminant, remember that's the thing that we were working to begin with, because that's the hard part. B squared minus 4ac. We call that discriminant. It's very, very important. If the discriminant is positive and the square root of an integer, you're going to get two rational solutions. Well, what I mean with that is, if my b squared minus 4ac is something like, let's say, 144, right? It's a positive, and it's the square root of an integer, because I can get the square root of 144, right? It gives me a perfect number. My answer would be two rational solutions. So basically, my answer could be written as a fraction. My two answers could be written as a fraction. Now, if my discriminant is still positive, but not the square root of an integer, I'm thinking of, 50. That's not a perfect square, but it's still positive. I cannot get the square root of 50, but at least I can simplify the radical. My answer will be two irrational solutions. What I mean with that is that I'm going to have two answers, and there's a radical sign in it. Now, if my discriminant is 0, I just get one solution. So, matter of fact, we saw that in an example. Let me come back to the example where we saw it. I had a case where my square root was 0. Here, in example 2. My square root was 0. My discriminant was 0. And look, my answer was just one fraction. It could be a fraction, it could be a whole number, but I just got one solution. So now going back to the slide where we were, if my discriminant is 0, I just get one rational solution, right? One answered, and it can be written as a fraction. Now, if my discriminant is negative, think of the square root of negative 9. It doesn't matter if the number is a perfect square or not a perfect square, but is the square root of a negative. If my discriminant is a negative, I'm going to get two non-real complex solutions. What that means is my answer should have an I in it. Now, we're just worried about what type of solutions we're going to get at this moment. So remember your quadratic formula, and you're just looking at the square root part. Now here it says find the discriminant. Let me remember it. It's just the blue part. And use it to predict the number of and type of solutions for each equation. So let me identify my A is 6, my B is -1, and my C is -15. So remember your discriminant B squared. Remember, the boy was being squared, so he lost a chance with 4 awesome chicks. Now I'm just going to go -1 squared minus 4 times 6 times -15. -1 squared is 1. I'm just going to write plus, because negative with a negative give me plus. Now let me multiply 4 times 6 times 15. That gives me 360. Now 1 plus 360 is 361. Then I ask myself, the square root of 361, is that even a perfect square? I grab my calculator and I get the square root of 361 gives me 19. All right, so it is a perfect square. So because my discriminant was a positive and I could get the square root of it, I don't need to get my solutions, right? Now here it says, use it to predict the numbered and type of solutions. I get a perfect square. So I'm just going to get two rational solutions. You don't have to solve for the whole two solutions. It's just asking, what type of solutions are you going to get? We can solve it if you want to. And you're going to see that you have two answers that can be written as a fraction. But in this case, it's just asking, what type of solutions are you going to get? Now, let's take a look at example B. My 5, let me move it over as a minus 5. So I have this as 3x squared minus 4x minus 5 is equal to 0. So I have that my A is 3, my B is negative 4, my C is negative 5. Let me remember the quadratic formula. I'm looking at B squared minus 4AC. The boy was being square, so he lost a chance with 4 awesome chicks. All right, so negative 4 all squared minus 4 times 3 times negative 5. Now, negative 4 squared is 16. On the right, plus, because I see 2 negative signs. All right, 2 negative signs make it a positive sign. Now I'm thinking 4 times 3 times 5, that's 60. 16 plus 60 is 76. Okay, it's a positive answer, but can I get the square root of 76? That's not a perfect square root. I can even grab my calculator, it's going to give me a decimal, like 8 point something. Now, it is not a perfect square, so I'm just going to get 2 irrational solutions. Let me come back to this. I'll get 2 irrational solutions. Once again, it's not asking to find a solution. It's asking what type of solution I'm getting. Let me go back one slide. Just look at the first 2 cases here. My first one was a positive and it was a perfect square, so I get 2 rational solutions. My second example was positive, but not the square root of not the square of an integer, so I get 2 irrational solutions. Now, let's take a look at example C. My 12x, because I must have that side equal to 0, my 12x, let me move it over. So I have this as 4x squared minus 12x plus 9 is equal to 0. Notice I put it in a way that the exponent of the x goes down. Right, I put it in that order. All right, I know my A is 4, my B is negative 12, and my C is 9. Remember, my B is negative 12. Let me remember the quadratic formula. I'm just looking at the discriminant. The boy was being square, so he lost a chance with 4 awesome chicks. All right, B squared, so I'm looking at this as negative 12 squared minus 4 times 4 times 9. Negative 12 squared, right? Negative 12 times negative 12 gives me 144 minus 4 times 4 times 9. That also gives me 144. 144 minus 144 is 0. My discriminant is 0. Remember, let me go back a couple slides. Now we have this case. When my discriminant is 0, I get 1 rational solution. So here my discriminant was 0, so I get 1 rational solution. Take a look at example D. The right side is equal to 0, so I'm good. One side is equal to 0. My A is 4. My B is 1, because that's the number in front of the x. It's basically 1x. And my C is 1. Let me remember the quadratic formula. So I'm just looking at the boy was being squared, so he lost a chance with 4 awesome chicks. All right, B squared. So I have 1 squared minus 4 times 4 times 1. So I have 1 minus 16th. I know that's going to equal to negative 15th. My discriminant in this case is negative. Let me go back a couple slides. My discriminant is negative, so my solution should be 2 non-real complex solutions. What I'm going to write is 2 non-real complex solutions. What it means is that I'm going to have 2 answers, and I'm going to have an I. Now you try this at home. For this example, for example, A and B, my discriminant on A is positive 41. So 2 rational solutions, because 41 is not a perfect square. For example B, you get that your discriminant is negative 23. So 2 non-real complex solutions. One thing on example A, don't forget the 4, you got to bring it to the left though when you work that. Okay, for example C, once again, you do this at home. Remember the quadratic formula. You're looking at the discriminant only. For example C, you're going to get that your discriminant is 0. So you get 1 rational solution. For example D, you're going to get the discriminant is 961. 961 is the perfect square, right? 31 squared is 961. So you should get 2 rational solutions. It's not asking you to solve for all your cases. It's just asking for you guys to think what type of solutions you're going to get.